Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and this is our 166th segment of our Journey of Faith in the Light of the Cross, and I thank you so much for journeying with us. We go to our screen and we see what's the theme. It's a complicated theme. Marriage and God's covenant of faith in the context of the Shema prayer in Deuteronomy, its original context, prepared the way for Jesus' teaching on marriage and covenant of faith in the context of the Shema prayer in the Gospels, 600 years later. So now we go to our next screen and we read, history says all Bible editors taught monogamy as a cultural law during the Babylonian exile. Why was it necessary to be cultural, not scriptural? The P, that's the priestly editors, could not teach monogamy as Torah, for Moses had 2 wives. So the priest emphasized the struggles of Abraham and Sarah as sojourners, resident aliens. So what are we saying? They were forced, because the Mosaic law couldn't cope with this new evolution, to go back to the original covenant God made with Abraham, which is taken up further by Jesus. And then we see the D editors. This is the Deuteronomic writers, They believed in a prophetic oral tradition that evolved to monogamy, but permitted divorce, So in the Deuteronomy, the second law, they try to show it evolved, but they still can't do it through the Mosaic law. Jesus used the same oral tradition to say divorce was wrong. Jesus taught on divorce just before he says that the Shema love of God and love of neighbor is the greatest commandment on which all other teachings hang. So you see the context. Everything is in the light of the Shema prayer and love of your neighbor. And then we go to marriage. We go to our next screen. Matthew 19, this is just before chapter 22 when Jesus quotes the Shema prayer. Some Pharisees asked, is it ever lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? They asked this because they were afraid Jesus was going to take their teaching to its logical conclusion, and they were afraid of it. Jesus answered, have you not read in the beginning he made the male and female? And the one Creator said, it's very important that they put one Creator said, thus a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the 2 shall become one flesh. They are no longer 2, but one flesh. What's the importance here? The God of Israel was the only God that was one. All other pagan gods had a mother and father God reflecting the human situation. Only Israel said, when a man and woman come together in one, they are godlike. They become one with God. Thus, what God has joined, let no one separate. When they become one in marriage, they're one with God in the work of giving life. We go on to our next screen. They said, then why did Moses permit divorce? And Jesus said, because you were so hard-hearted. Jesus is using the words of the prophets. Whoever divorces his wife except for porneia and marries another commits adultery. This is very important. Now, porneia, as we've said several times, is an unclean marriage not blessed by Israeli authorities, in Jesus' time by a rabbi. Now we go and we look, Jesus uses words of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, hard-heartedness, that Israel was too hard-hearted to hear God's words of love. Why? Because porneia's sexual images calloused. We've been talking about this. How do you callous our hearts? We don't know. But if you really callous your heart, it even deadens the heart. And it deadens the heart's ability to love people in the flesh. For fantasy, and that's what porneia is, isolates people from reality as desperate zombies. We use the new word because zombies are half-dead people. And people with addictions always say, I felt dead. That's because they are in unreality, mood changing, rather than reality, where love is. We go on to our next screen. The prophets, in the time of the Babylonian exile, they looked back and saw a family breakdown was caused by David's adultery 500 years before. And then the division and then destruction of Israel and Judah, both countries, were caused by Solomon's porneia wives. So the people's hearts drifted from God. They rejected and abandoned God. The prophets started emphasizing the covenant of faith, God made with Abraham, because the Mosaic law couldn't cope with this situation. The Pharisees taught monogamy, but they wanted divorce. Jesus brought all together by teaching that Abraham's covenant of faith was eternal, but the Mosaic law, because it couldn't cope with it, had to be crucified in the light of the cross to open up its eternal value. And in the light of the cross is the same as the teaching, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. Why? Because it was best exemplified by Jesus on the cross. We go on to our next screen. We look at the timeline. We began with Jesus talking about divorce. We went back to the temple is destroyed. This period here is the exile. And that's when so much writing was done, and the Bible we have today was completed. And they say Moses' law can't cope with it, so they went back to Abraham 430 years before, and that was God preparing the way for Jesus. We go on to our next screen. And we see in the light of the covenant of faith, rather than the light of the Mosaic law, divorce is wrong. The pure priest editors in Babylon, in the exile, taught monogamy, and they said, well, how are we going to get it in? So they emphasized marital struggles of Abram and Sarah many years before. Genesis 12 begins salvation history with the covenant of faith. The Lord said to Abram, go to a land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. All ethnics will be blessed in you. Okay, this is the covenant of faith. So Abraham and Sarah start journeying. Now, in verse 10, a famine caused Abram to sojourn in Egypt. He said to Sarai, when Egyptians see your beauty, they will say, kill the husband, but let her live. So please say you are my sister. Now this sounds very shameful and embarrassing that Abraham should say this, but he did it for survival of family. We go on to our next screen. Sarah was taken to Pharaoh, and she married him. So Abram prospered. This is terrible. He's doing well because he was able to do this, or was it right that through faith he kept his composure, for he received many possessions? But the Lord struck Pharaoh with plagues. The Lord said he's not going to get away with this. So Pharaoh said, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? So I took her for my wife, and we assume that they consummated their relationship. Take her and be gone. Now, shameful and humiliating, as all this was, but marriage survived. The marriage, even under God, prospered because they were faithful in shame and humiliation. This story is in chapter 12, the same as the covenant of faith. We go to our next screen. Why was it important to write this down? The exiles in Babylon in the 6th century were consoled by this story, for they had similar shame and humiliation in Babylon. Remember, they were taken there as slaves, and people could humiliate them and shame them just like Pharaoh did. So the story is repeated in Genesis 20 and Genesis 26. 3 times this story is told. But with Isaac and Rebekah in Genesis 26, they reinforce it. Marriage had to survive deep shame if Israel was to survive, whether in Abraham's time or in the Babylonian exile. They can't reject or abandon one another because of shame. All this goes back to God's heroic, everlasting love for Israel, despite the humiliating shame of exile, which God felt when they went into exile because of their sins. We go on to our next screen. Though Israel rejected and abandoned God, in his heroic love, God never rejected or abandoned Israel. Fidelity to God's covenant meant Israelis were to be heroically faithful to each other as God was faithful, especially in the marriage covenant. We go on to our next screen. Marriage and God's covenant of faith in the context of the shame of prayer in Deuteronomy during the Babylonian exile prepared the way for Jesus' teaching on marriage and covenant of faith in the context of the shame of prayer in the Gospels. I thank you so much for journeying with us. I hope we can continue in this theme in our next segment, so hopefully you'll stick with us. Thank you so much.